Yeah. So you mean now you're stacked?
Well, more like it's all right. You should be ready.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. Well, thank you for being here on a Friday, and a rainy Friday at that. I'm Deb Trocha, the Executive Director of the Indiana Cooperative Development Center. And today's program introduces the housing co-op model and how that model can address the current housing shortage in both our rural communities, our cities, our totally communities across the country. Lack of housing has an enormous impact on the quality of life. And community leaders are seeking solutions to the housing crisis. And we're presenting the housing co-op model as a solution to that crisis. Co-ops have been around for a very long time, since the mid-19th century, and have proven to be effective in addressing the housing crisis. We've got some terrific speakers for you today who are going to discuss the co-op business model, the who, how, what, when, where, and why, and not to forget, how do you finance housing co-ops? Please help yourself to water and coffee in the back. The restrooms are out those doors, just down the hall, straight ahead of you. We're not scheduling breaks today, so if you need to get up and move around, please feel free to do that. We've got a lot of great material and didn't want to take the time to take breaks, so please take care of yourself from that perspective. You have agendas. The speaker bios are on those agendas, so we're not going to spend a lot of time introducing speakers. We want to give them as much time as possible to share that information with you. Also on the tables, and for those of you who are online, JRU will have a poll to help us know how we're doing with this conference. It's really important as we do conferences in the future that we know where we need to make adjustments and improvements. So please take a few minutes to complete those at some point today during the conference. So our first speaker is my colleague, Brian Donovan. He's with the Cooperation Group in Michigan. And Brian has a very long history in housing cooperatives and is quite the expert. Hence, he's leading off the program and kind of leading the day. So Brian, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to. I really appreciate it. And it's nice to see on the Zoom that we've got people from Detroit and Highland Park, where I'm from, and all around the country, including us, an aide for city council first. Policy matters. So my name is Brian Donovan. I'm with the Cooperation Group. I live in Highland Park, Michigan. And I work in Detroit and also in Ann Arbor. I will say that I have been working with housing co-ops since 2005, which I guess does feel like a really long time.
Hey, Brian, could I have you stand up at the podium? It's a little bit quiet for the folks online.
Okay. I can also turn this up.
Oh, yeah, that'd be good.
Turn this up. All right. Well, I can just speak more loudly towards the mic. Hopefully that will help. Does it?
You're better where you are. You step about two. When you were over here, it got quiet, but about 2 steps to that direction. And
I think it's just because I was facing this way towards the mic. I'll work on that. All right. So hopefully that's going to help. And let me know if that isn't loud enough. As I was saying, I live and work in Michigan. I've been working with housing cooperatives since 2005. My background before that was in politics. And I did work for Apple for 8 years before deciding that there were more important things that I should be working on, but some computers. So before we get started, though, I'd like to know a little bit more about you. And I'm particularly interested in what you're hoping to gain from this event today. But I want to know your name, a little bit about yourself. I think we have maybe too many people to go through everyone, but I would like to invite as many people that want to share what you're hoping to get from this event today. So I can try to make sure that you get it. And if I'm not able to get that for you, just work on getting it for you after the event.
Yeah, I say we might have to have you at the podium because
Okay.
it's a little bit hard to hear.
All right, well, I'll get in the corner then. I'll move these.
Try to lock it down.
I like to walk around when I talk, but I can move over. Okay, so I'd just like to invite folks to go ahead. You can raise your hand if you're here or if you're on the Zoom to be able to introduce yourself and say what you're hoping to gain from this event.
Oh, I'll break the ice.
Thank you.
Friday morning. We're all good, right? All right, so I'm Lisa Laughlin. I'm with West Indianapolis Development Corporation. We do affordable housing just a little bit southwest of downtown. And while I've been following KEPRA and the potential CLT conversation, I'm always looking for additional tools to put in our box to create more affordable housing in our community.
Can we have the pictures of the different types of co-ops going on the screen? Okay, who else wants to go?
I can go next. I'm Alvin with Kepler. Excited to be here with y'all. Just here to learn and meet new people.
Okay, who's next?
I'll pop. Eager, you're next.
Kepra as well in housing space. And I've been mediating and I'm getting so much information and tools.
Thank you.
I'm Jane. I'm a retired Ball State faculty member on Deb's board, and I love everything co-op, so I always come when I can to learn more and interact with those who are also interested.
Excellent. Okay.
I'm Nick, and this is Eric. We work on a farm on the northwest side of town. And one of the issues we're seeing addressing food accessibility is that it's not like a single issue. It's this web of housing accessibility, gentrification, police brutality, all these things overlaid. Like we could grow the best food in the world, but that would necessarily solve the food accessibility issue. So we're trying to look at different angles.
Okay, that's great. So I'll just say that again because you're far from the mic. That was a web of issues that affect my issues. So you're from a farm working on food accessibility, but housing ties in for that. Anyone else? On the Zoom, maybe?
Yeah, so on Zoom, we got Sean. It says in rural Midwest communities, how can this model provide incentive for builders, developers to take on affordable housing projects in rural areas where they may make more money with market rate single family homes?
Okay, I will say that again too. So that was a question about rural areas. How can this be an incentive for builders to build for affordability if there's greater return on investment on market rate housing? Okay. Anyone else on the Zoom then?
Okay, go ahead.
My name's Nate Howard. I came up or down from Muncie. I work for Muncie Land Bank. And I am more than anything interested in just kind of learning about different models. We have issues with affordable housing in Muncie, and feel like kind of trying to build a bridge between some of the really innovative things that are happening in other places. So yeah, this is introductory for me, but yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
We do have a couple more from Zoom. Sure. Richard, sorry for missing your comment. Richard says that he is a nonprofit affordable housing developer, and he's looking to learn more about how finance tax credit finance affordable housing for co-ops.
Okay, so tax credit, how a co-op might be able to use tax credit financing. Go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay. My name's Neil Crane, AJ, all right. Good to see you. Yeah, I'm a neighborhood pastor on the south side of Muncie, and always working together with neighbors to solve housing struggles. So many. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
We got a couple more comments on Zoom as well.
You need to use have the mic on when you're talking to be sure they can hear.
Oh, okay. My fault, everybody. So our next comment comes from Sam. Sam says, "I'm looking for a tool for a tool that faith congregations can use to help with the affordable housing."
That's great.
Yeah, sort of a, ooh.
It's okay to be loud.
Hello. Okay, I'll just yeah. My name's Tony. I'm the executive director of Indie Community Development. We're interested in housing co-ops. It's kind of adjacent to the previous comment. We'd like to have a permanent indoor practice space for community, also the community center, but also serves as affordable housing for a lot of have a lot of single people, we have people who probably other single, but they also want community because it's really isolated living in our world. And create something like that. But how do you do that? How do you get the money for that? There's financing, but there's also issues like how do you ask somebody to leave? How do you equitably manage the finances and running people with different income? So those are just a few of the things.
Okay, I'll try to restate that. You can tell me how I did. So you're with a community yoga nonprofit. You're looking for a community space that you can operate in that would also be able to provide housing that was affordable and provide a community to the people that live there. And how can that work equitably with all these people with different interests and income levels all participating in making that happen?
Yeah, and how do you mitigate all the risks that are involved in that sort of?
And mitigating the risks. So I think we'll generally be talking about that when we're looking at cooperatives and particularly with cooperative housing, because living, sharing, collectively owning your living is definitely a serious relationship with it. Anyone else? Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I work for American. I work for American Love. My job is to make sure all housing, multi purpose housing is smoke free. We know that the second and third thing that smoke is affecting our children along with their don't have food. They have asthma, they have breathing problems, and I just want to make sure the word gets out that the second apartments in the state of Indiana go smoke-free. My second hat is a personal family favorite of ours. I'm representing Mother's Love's Garden. We're on the west side of Indianapolis, and we're here to help the community of 46208 get food out into the community. We also are developing some areas so we can put small houses on our property to make sure the homeless have somewhere to live. Thank you. Anybody next?
We do got some folks from Zoom.
Anybody want the mic? Anybody want to introduce yourself this morning?
We've got some folks on Zoom.
Yeah, I'm gonna shout some folks out from Zoom. So we got someone by the name of Quentin in the chat. Thanks for joining us today. They say, I have heard about co-ops as a good solution to providing low-cost, high-value housing. I'm curious about methods for scaling their development and how local governments can incentivize their growth.
Scaling, I love that. And how local governments can promote the growth of cooperatives as a solution. Okay, you got another one?
Yeah, so I do have some more on Zoom. Thanks everybody for tuning in on Zoom and leaving your chats. Our next person, we got Sarah. Sarah says, I'm the executive director of the Cooperative Council of North Carolina, and we are always here to help our fellow co-ops, ongoing projects. Maybe they weren't actually asking for anything. Let's see. Okay, and we got one more. It looks like Thomas Beckett. Tom, thanks for joining us. Said, I am looking forward to a great survey of housing approaches. In particular, I want to learn how housing co-ops address conflict resolution.
Okay, conflict resolution. Hey, this is stuck on one slide. Can we go to?
I developed a co-op in South Bend with 20 warehouses. And I'm here with the board president, and I want to hear about incentive systems for resident participation. And I thought the conflict resolution was
All right, incentives for participation. This is important. Because as we know, democracy is only as powerful as or it's only representative if people participate in it. And cooperatives are based on democracy.
one more.
Okay.
I've been interested in co-ops for a while, so just learn more, see like how, and echoing everything that she said, like how scale co-ops here in the city and the state, also how we can garner support from, Thank you, welcome.
All right. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you all being here. And if you do have questions, whether you're on Zoom or in person, as I'm going through the slides that I have, feel free to ask them. If I'm going to address it later in the slides, I'll say so. And there should be time at the end for discussion as well. Okay, so let's switch to the other presentation if we can. But I wanted to show some of these pictures just to see how different cooperatives can look. So that's what was scrolling around on there. And before I get started with this presentation, I want to say a big thank you to Terry Lewis, who actually put together most of these slides that I'm about to present. So does anybody here know who Terry Lewis is? I know there's some people on Zoom that do, because Terry's on the board of one of the people who's here. But Terry Lewis is a Co-op Hall of Famer. She was a long time with the National Cooperative Bank. She actually had a hand in writing the cooperative statute for the state of Michigan. And after a long career in DC, has moved back to living in Michigan as a retiree and continues to be involved with housing co-ops and also worker co-op development through the Center for Community-Based Enterprise, which is based in Detroit. They are primarily working on assisting owners of small businesses to sell their businesses to the workers as a worker co-op to retain those businesses. But Terry's history has been largely in housing. And this presentation, or these slides that I'm going to show, were ones that she put together for a presentation to the Michigan State Housing Development Authority back in 2018, and she gave me permission to use them. I've modified them a little bit, but this is really Terry's presentation, so I want to give her credit where credit is due. So let's start with what is a cooperative? I think we all can imagine what a cooperative is, but I want to just define it so we have an agreement. So it's a form of ownership. A cooperative is a form of ownership where people or entities, sometimes businesses, will come together to own and control the assets or processes, or assets and processes that are critical to their economic well-being. So this could be many, many types of things that cooperatives can be addressing in the world or in our economy today for people. So housing obviously is a very important one. I think we're in the midst of a really challenging time for housing, which we'll talk about more on the panel as well. But I want to just stress that it's people. Cooperatives are made of people, especially housing co-ops. That tends to be an association with the building or set of buildings, as that's the cooperative. But in fact, the cooperative are the people that live in the buildings. And the success or failure of the cooperative is going to be tied to the people. So involvement or engagement, as was suggested as one of the things that's critical, is certainly central to the success of any cooperative enterprise. Oh, do I have to go this way? Oh, I don't think this clicker is working. Sorry about that. I'll just ask you to click on this. Yeah, no problem. Which people? These values are actually ones that have been put together by the International Cooperative Alliance, which if you haven't checked it out, you can look at their website. It's ica.coop. But they're the international group that works to define what a cooperative is. They're the group that lobbied the United Nations to declare 2012 to be the International Year of the Cooperative. And they have identified these core values as critical ones to embody for the people that are going to be in the cooperative to embody if you're going to be successful. So if you're going to be part of a cooperative, you should have these values. If you're going to be developing a cooperative, you should look for these values in the people who are going to be joining you. Or in my case, I worked in cooperative development, so I was helping other people develop cooperatives. And really, when you're getting started, getting that steering committee together that's going to do the work of deciding how the group will function, you really need to have people who embody these things. And I'm just going to say them out loud because I think it's really important to fully understand what we're talking about here. But self-help and self-responsibility. So you're not waiting for somebody to do this. You are the person doing this, and you're doing it collectively, democratically, and equally. So co-ops have one member, one vote. So it doesn't matter that I have been working with co-ops for 20 years and maybe you don't know anything about co-ops. Your vote is just as valuable as mine. And your persuasive arguments are also just as valuable as mine. Now, that's much easier to say on paper, but we want people who feel that, who embody that if we're going to be successful with co-op. Then we also have equity and solidarity. which might seem like they're similar to democracy and equality, but they're really not. Because you have to make room for people whose voices have been suppressed to be able to express themselves. And when things don't go your way, you have to still come together behind the decision that's made by the group. I mean, that's what solidarity is. So this is actually about being able to have our arguments in a way that's fair and in a way that everybody comes back together as a group and say, you know what, that isn't how I wanted it to be, or that isn't how I thought it should be. But I have now come around, and that's how we're going to be. And then honesty and openness, I think in some ways, I mean, I don't know, I've been looking for that my whole life. These are the people I want to be in a relationship who are going to tell me what's going on, and are going to be honest about their perception of what's going on, and also listening to my perception of what's going on. And then lastly is social responsibility and caring for others. Now, I already heard that from several people in the room. Your career is about social responsibility and caring for others. But these are the values that are most important when you're starting a cooperative. And it does point to, you know, just because you can build a building doesn't mean these people are going to show up. You need to have your people together before you start building a building. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. Okay, so this is really, I'm sorry, the title is cut off the top, but hopefully others can see it. But this is a comparison of cooperative ownership versus investor ownership. So in a cooperative, there's a one-to-one relationship between the owners of the business and the people who use its assets. So that would be the customers, the workers, the people who actually use and work on the business. And an investor-owned business, which is really the water we're swimming in here in the United States, then the users are third parties, not even connected to governance or ownership. So all these businesses that are reaching out to you to, hey, come be our customer. Well, they're not giving you any share of the ownership. They're not giving you, you don't get any say on the board of directors. Just come spend your money with us. And this is the way things work now. And a cooperative is entirely different, where the people that are actually using the assets own the assets. Okay, we can go on to the next one. Okay, so how does this play out in a housing cooperative? The last slides are true with any type of cooperative. So first of all, it's a corporation. So when you start a cooperative, it's a corporation. Don't be discouraged by the fact that it's a corporation. It's going to have articles of incorporation and bylaws that make it into a community-owned entity. With the housing co-op, the residents own the shares. Now that doesn't mean they own the building. The corporation owns the building, but those shares give a right to occupy the spaces. So when you have a share, you're going to sign an occupancy agreement that's going to say, Brian Donovan lives in this unit or this address if it's different houses. And then that is granted by the corporation. So we can go on to the next one. So there's also democratic governance. I mentioned this before. There's only one class of members, right? So there's not the people who've invested the most money and the rest of the people, like there are in most, the way voting works in most organizations. Everybody is in at the same level as a member, one vote. Now, there is representation. The bigger the co-op is, then you may not be on the board for making all the decisions. So you will elect a board of directors who will do the oversight, hire the staff or the other resources that are necessary, and then make sure that things are happening according to the values and mission of the organization. But members still retain rights on the big picture items. So if the bylaws are getting changed, the members have to vote to do that. And if the co-op is going to sell out, The members certainly have to vote to do that. Okay, one. So operation at cost. Now that sounds simple, like, hey, we just, only charge people exactly what it needs to be spent, which is what happens. But you need to calculate what the costs are. You've got maybe a contract for property management, you've got debt that you owe, you've got taxes to pay, and you want to build up reserves. So the last one about building up reserves, so you're not budgeting for zero. You're budgeting for sufficient assets to be able to handle an emergency if it happens. So you have money in the bank to pay your deductible on an insurance claim, or you have money in the bank to buy somebody out if they have to go from the cooperative. So you're not budgeting for zero, but you are being prepared. Basically, if you don't need the money, you're not charging the members for money. It is about efficient operations, no matter what type of housing co-op model you might use. And then each member pays his or her proportionate share of the annual costs through charges. So if you're part of a housing co-op, you will be paying every month your share of the collective costs. And then depending on depending on the type of housing co-op, you might have additional costs for your interest for being a member. And we'll look at that. Co-ops are very flexible, and we'll look at how they're flexible. So this is also important. So the subordination of investment value to use value, that sounds kind of technical. But what that means is it's more important to deliver the value of the assets than it is to make money on the assets or to have a return on investment. Even co-ops where you get a return, where you get a share of appreciation, it's more important to have a quality place to live at a reasonable price. No profits are paid to outside third parties. You might borrow money, but that isn't a profit sharing situation. You're just paying back for cash borrowed. And also net savings are redistributed to members. So the co-op where I work is actually a nonprofit. So we're not legally allowed to pay cash back out to members, but it rolls into the next year. And it means we don't have to charge as much if we generated a surplus in the previous year, or it rolls into reserves, which means we're more secure for being able to handle any bumps in the road that might come along. But there are cooperatives which do deliver equity back to the members. They're not a nonprofit. And in that case, if there's a surplus, that can be redistributed back out to members, because we really don't want to be charging people more than what the operation and reasonable reserves would cover. Okay. So one of the reasons I showed the slides earlier, I don't know if you got a chance to look at it, but it can be any type of building, right? So in Detroit alone, there are a lot of housing cooperatives, and there's single family housing co-ops. And I believe there's a land trust that has a scattered site or a scattered site cooperative here. But it could be an apartment building, it could be townhouses, it could be a high rise, any type of building can work. Also, we've got that it can be a lot of different demographics inside the same building or inside the same co-op. And there are a lot of ways to balance affordability versus wealth creation, depending on what the goals are of the people that are part of the co-op. And then the actual ownership form itself has some flexibility as well. There are slides on each of these, so we can walk. So I kind of explained some of these already, but one of the fastest growing types of co-ops, of housing co-ops, are actually manufactured home co-ops. So there's a group that started in New Hampshire that finances mobile home parks buying the land underneath their homes. So with mobile homes, you actually own the house, but you have to pay to be in the location where you are that has sewage and water coming to you. And then you're paying the person who owns the land. And that has become an increasingly identified as a way to raise a lot of money. So people with a lot of assets are snapping up the land under mobile homes where you can't really, I mean, mobile home is a misnomer. You can't move your mobile home. So you're stuck with that landlord. And so increasingly, manufactured home parks are buying the land under them and owning it collectively to control the cost. So it isn't somebody just trying to extract as much as possible out of them. But it could be, as I mentioned, detached family homes, lofts, townhouses. This co-op where I work now is a student co-op, and it's group living in big old mansions in Ann Arbor that are 120 years old, shared kitchens, shared bathrooms, as many people as the city will let us squeeze into the buildings. So we can go on to the next one. First of all, the co-op, you need to mean to do a co-op. And this is also why I have the slide on which people. So you need to, it's an intentional community. Even if the intention is just being affordable, you have to have some kind of shared intention, and you have to mean to form it. This is not a build it and they will come situation. And then the affinity group can be based on a lot of different things. It could be shared needs, could be shared values. And I will just point out, because I think that the way co-ops can benefit a rural community are quite different than how they can develop can impact a community in the city. And also, you know, there's groups where the values are actually decreasing, right? So how can we keep from being in decline? And also, you know, there's other places where values are increasing way out of hand and people are being forced out of neighborhoods. And co-ops can work for both of those directions, depending on what the needs are. But you need to have a group of people that are that need the same thing, and you can design the co-op to be able to meet those needs. And it also creates a sense of ownership. Even though you only have a share in the corporation, that is still, as the corporation, that is your building or your buildings. It creates economies of scale. So if you have 20 people who are all part of this corporation, you're more powerful in being able to borrow money, and being able to influence the city or the neighborhood than you would be if you were just yourself doing that. And also reciprocity. So when you start working together, you start to recognize who has skills doing what, and you each kind of contribute your strengths to the group. That means that the group overall is stronger than if it were just your strengths, or if it were just my strengths and my weaknesses. We can go on to the next one. Okay, so there's a lot on this slide. I'll just say that first. But this is looking at the ways that you can change based on the different needs that people have, how the co-op model is adaptable. So we'll start with the kind of the maximum return situation. Let's go back to the last. So on the market rate co-ops, so this is about building wealth for the participations. And market rate is still a little bit of a misnomer, but the point there is the shares can sell for as much as the market will bear. So as long as you're in, you're still operating efficiently. You're operating at a very low cost, but the way to enter is a higher cost that is determined by the market. Now the co-op still has to approve whoever's moving in. So the seller is going to sell to whoever got approved that's willing to pay the highest price for that share. And in that way, the member actually gets a financial return on the appreciation of their share in the co-op. So this is typically what's happening in, say, New York City or other urban areas where values are increasing. There were a lot of housing cooperatives that started out as affordable housing co-ops, getting loans from HUD that constrained the income that people could move in. And when those loans were paid off after 30 years, a lot of them, the members voted to switch to market rate. And they did it because, hey, this is an opportunity. You know, I have been a member, I've contributed to this co-op, and they decided that there should be a way to recognize the equity for the years of time that they put in. And so that's kind of the way that would max, that's on the extreme end of building wealth as opposed to affordability. It's still affordable, right? Because the operations are still up as efficient as possible. It's just entering costs more. So there's definitely a barrier. And I will point out that the first housing co-ops, or I don't know about the first, but the early ones in New York City, for instance, in the 1800s, it was definitely about keeping the riffraff out. So co-ops can be elitist too. Not that that's a good thing, but one of the pluses of a co-op is the members get to approve who moves in. And it's about having the shared values. But I think there is a danger of becoming exclusive or elitist, and that certainly has happened. I don't think that's the case with most co-ops that exist today, even the market rate co-ops. It is actually about operating efficiently and delivering value for the members. Now, limited equity co-ops also deliver some wealth. I think you'll hear about in the panel some ways that wealth can be created for members that are living in co-ops through a land trust with a cooperative on top of it. There can also just be a cap on the return. So instead of it being an open market, and you can just take whoever's willing to pay the highest price, there's a prescribed price. So one of the biggest senior housing co-op developments guarantees a 1% per year appreciation, which assumes that the market will go up more than that. And then when somebody leaves, though, they're guaranteed 1%. So, and it's senior housing as well. So it protects the value of that asset. So if I'm a senior, I'm selling my house that I mostly own or have free and clear, and then I'm moving into a senior housing co-op, I want to be sure that that value isn't lost to my descendants or whoever I want to be able to have an inheritance to. So in that way, there is a guaranteed appreciation. It might be less than inflation, but there will be an asset there at the end when I pass away or I need to move out into assisted living circumstances. But the point there is that there's still, when you sell, you're getting money back, but it's just limited so that anyone, it's meant to be more accessible to people who might not have the means to be able to otherwise participate. But the affordability of occupancy is the same, right? So we're still, it's cheap to live there. And in this case, the barrier to entry is lower because of an agreement that you sign when you become a member. So there's less wealth creation, but there is still some wealth development that's happening. Now, the third one is group equity cooperatives or mutual housing associations. The student group that I manage called the Inter-Cooperative Council in Ann Arbor is one of these. So students turn over rapidly. It's a very low barrier of entry. There's a $100 membership fee. And it is about keeping the price as low as possible so that they're borrowing less money, so that they can afford to live in Ann Arbor and attend the University of Michigan. Otherwise, they might not be able to afford to attend the University of Michigan, even if they were accepted, because the cost of living in Ann Arbor is higher than any other city in Michigan. Now, there is no wealth creation here, except that you're putting out as low of money as possible to be able to live there. So there actually is some wealth creation, but the co-op isn't doing it. The co-op is just delivering a quality product at a very low price. If you're able to sock away some money or not spend all of your student loans, whatever it might be, then you can do that because you had to pay less for housing. So this is the most deeply affordable solution. And you could argue that low-income housing tax credit cooperatives are the most deeply affordable solution, because tax credits might allow you to house people who are extremely low income, like 30% median family income, or 50 or 60%. So what the tax credits do, and they're complicated, and I'm happy to talk more about them offline, but what tax credits are is they allow companies who owe a lot of income tax, corporate tax, to be able to, instead of paying the tax, put money into affordable housing. And this is mostly how affordable housing has been done. There's a 15-year commitment And there's a corporation created that is a conglomerate of a very, very tiny portion of that belongs to the nonprofit who's operating the housing group. And then mostly it's the tax credit investors. And at the end of 15 years, the tax credit investors sell out. And there would need to be, if it's going to work for a cooperative, there would have to be a commitment at the point of development to when you sell, you will be selling to the cooperative. Because there's nothing that says that those tax credit investors have to sell to the cooperative unless they sign something that says they have to at the start. So this is possible. It's not common. There's, in fact, a trend for LIHTC projects or low-income housing tax credit projects these days is for the tax credit investors to sell out right before the end to other speculators who then are trying to maximize their profit on the exit, which will not happen if they have to sell to the co-op at a set price. And the price doesn't have to be set with a number. It might just be a certain, appreciating with inflation and the market or whatever. But there needs to be an agreement to sell at a reasonable price to the co-op if that's going to work. Now, there is a substantial wealth creation opportunity here because you can change into a market co-op from a LIHTC co-op if that's what the members want to do, or you can keep it at a group equity and just keep that price as low as possible and keep that barrier to entry as low as possible. So before I move on from this slide, because like I said, there's a lot there, if people have questions, I am happy to address those. Anybody on the Zoom? Don't see anybody on Zoom right now. Okay, well, yay. Glad I was able to articulate that clearly enough for folks. Okay, go ahead.
Probably pretty. Okay. Just because I'm also learning about community land trusts. I'm just trying to understand the distinction. I know that how they work together is probably can be very complex and there's probably different variations. But like, how would you just explain that? Because in my mind, I'm thinking quickly, like it all has to be together, but it doesn't necessarily. How's a housing cooperative not in some way doing the same thing that community land trust would do? That's my main question.
Okay.
Enough for you to answer.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm happy to address that. So in a housing cooperative, in a typical housing cooperative, the land and the access to the property is all tied together. And you might still be leasing, right? So the cooperative doesn't have to own the property, but obviously you want to secure a long-term lease. If you're going to borrow money for 35 years, you want to be sure you're not going to be kicked out at 10. That could be a way to work with a land trust. Then you have a landlord you can trust, right? So the landlord is going to be there long-term. They're committing to lease to you for 50 years or some long period of time at whatever price is set or whatever's negotiated. That could be very low or it could be market-based or moving with inflation. But a land trust often, it doesn't have to be, but often owns the land and then leases the building or sells the building to tenants. So in a land trust, there could be single family homes that are actually sold to families that the building would belong to the family and the land would belong to the land trust. And there could also be another financial relationship where that land trust would actually lease access to the building, a kind of a full lease even of the land and the building to the people who live there and retain ownership of the whole thing. So cooperative can exist with a land trust to be that entity that is leasing the buildings or building, depending on if it's an apartment building or townhouse.
Most often see.
I like the model of a land trust leasing to a cooperative because it decreases the likelihood of the members deciding to sell out if the market appreciated a lot. Because it's very tempting to be that group 30 years down the line who are suddenly sitting on an asset that's fully paid off to say, oh, we're going to sell this to a developer, or we're going to go market rate and just say we should be able to sell our shares for as much as the market will bear to people who we would qualify. So a land trust can have by contract a limit to ensure that it stays, that the affordability of acquisition stays as low as possible, and that the property itself stays in the trust, as opposed to in a cooperative where it's up to the members to decide if they ultimately want to sell.
Got a couple questions on that.
Okay.
So the first one comes from Thomas. And Thomas says, Brian, can you please elaborate again on the difference between group and limited equity co-ops?
Okay.
Brian,
So-
if you'll repeat the question so everyone can hear it.
So the question was, can I elaborate further on the difference between limited equity and group equity co-ops or mutual housing associations? So with limited equity, there is a goal of both keeping the affordability of acquisition, being able to get in as a member low, but also building wealth for the members. So with limited equity, and there's a whole range of what you can do here. Like I described the guaranteed 1% appreciation. That's one possible method of limiting the equity. It could also be that you can only sell for 50% of the shared appreciated value. So you can have a formula built in that says how much it's going to cost for the next person to come in, or how much below market. Maybe you're going to only be able to sell for 75% of market value. That would be by contract. But that way, when you leave, you're leaving with some money. You chipped into that co-op being successful. You invested in keeping that building and land up to date. You probably contributed to the neighborhood being better by being part of that co-op, all of which you get a piece of in a limited equity cooperative. Now you get that piece, but not in money with a group housing co-op. You contribute to the neighborhood, you learn skills, but when you leave, that next person is coming in for exactly what you paid. So with a student group, it's $100 to get in. And when you move out, it's going to be $100 for the next person. With the limited equity, if it was $100 to get in, you might get $500 back when you leave if you were there 10 years, or whatever formula you might work out.
We did have a couple of more questions. The next question comes from Karen. And Karen says, what's the experience with limited equity co-ops outside of the state of New York managing their reserves so they have an adequate amount of capital improvements?
Okay, well, I think that's a good question. And certainly with the student co-ops, the goal is that the price is low as possible. So investing in the buildings tends to be deferred. So the question though was, what's the experience with limited equity cooperatives setting aside enough reserves to maintain their properties and do the necessary capital investments? And also outside of New York State, I think she was asking about. So I think this is actually true with all the co-ops, right? The goal in all of them, you'll see it here, affordability of occupancy is right in there as a core goal. So if the board doesn't want to increase the rates enough to do the capital investment, and there will always be a draw for that, then it might mean that loans have to be taken out when the sewage system fails in the building or on the property, and suddenly you have this huge investment that you probably should have planned for and have reserves for, that you now have to go finance that, and everybody's rates go up. And this is true with single family homeowners too. I mean, how many people are ready to replace their lateral water line when it breaks? Very few. I mean, you're going to be borrowing money for that. And also, it's difficult to detect. You have to do the investment until it breaks. So this is why prudent reserves are important, and really cash reserves are important. You certainly want to have more cash reserves than your deductible on your insurance, right? You better be able to pay the deductible on your insurance. And I think you want to have enough to be able to survive a really serious problem. I mean, if you're in an apartment building and there's a fire, it takes out, 10 units, what are you going to do? Now you can have insurance that covers lost revenue that would mean that even though those have to be vacant for a period of time, how do you compensate those people that get displaced? But you better have some reserves because you will have to do that. They're still owners of the whole building. Everybody's owners of the whole building. But some people are going to get displaced, and how do you equitably handle that kind of thing? And this is why you have to have prudent reserves for emergencies and for just routine capital investment. But it is a chronic problem, just to specifically answer Karen's question.
We do have one more on Zoom. Robbie asked, is there a downside to using a land trust?
Well, it depends on, so as a developer, like I said, I like a land trust because it controls or it limits the ability for the members to decide that, hey, we've got this asset now, let's just cash out. So you have 30 years of members that were able to benefit, but whoever's in there at the moment of cashing out gets the appreciation value. So the land trust can limit that. There can also be ways, like in a limited equity cooperative, if they're voting to get out, there's probably a contract that everyone signed that limits how much they can get. So they're less likely to do it, but they could still do it and get whatever the limited amount out would be. And either go market or sell the building to someone else or the buildings.
So I thought that it was, I appreciated that you say that it's not like a build it and people will come kind of thing, that you already need people that have certain values or, as you said, like needs that are in common to be met. So what are some ways that different co-ops actually cultivate that value system, but also bring folks together that already have like that seed planted? Like what are I know for the group equity for the students, like of course they're all students, so like they're looking to live together affordably and that kind of thing. But outside of that, what are some tools that folks use to kind of coalesce people in that way?
That's a great question. And it's as a consultant, that's one of the first things I ask. I get called up by somebody who wants to make a co-op. It's like, well, who are your people that are going to be developing this? Is the first thing that I ask. And sometimes they just are thinking, well, I'll find them along the way. But no, you're not ready then. You need to find your people first. But I think just identifying people in the audience, I think faith-based groups are a great place to start. People who actually live together in a building. If there's, say, a tenants association in Washington, D.C., and increasingly in other places, I think in San Francisco and Minneapolis was looking at it too, there's a tenant's opportunity to purchase. So when a multifamily property goes up for sale, and in DC, even when a single family property goes up for sale, the tenant has to be notified and they have 60 days to put an offer together. Now, the owner doesn't have to buy it, but that gives 60 days. So there are nonprofit organizations that specialize in rallying tenants in DC to form a co-op in 60 days, figure out how much they can offer and make an offer on their building, which I love that. That's something I've been pushing for a while, and that for the aid of the Pittsburgh City Council person. I would encourage that for affordability, and that stops. Well, that can be a tool to limit gentrification, which I think happens in rapidly appreciated markets, or really in most cities, even if it's a slowly appreciated market. When the seller wants to sell, if the tenants buy it, then you get affordability of occupancy and the use value of the building being prioritized over the investment value. But I think community groups are important. You know, any kind of organizing effort that's going on can potentially lead to a cooperative being formed.
And then a follow-up question. So like, if you have something like that, where you have folks coming together that have common needs, so like you saying, rallying folks that are currently in a building to form cooperative. How, so like, when you're talking about like limited equity cooperatives and actually like putting money away, or like do entities like the one that would help those folks form the co-op, do they stay to help them like come up with values and stuff like that? Because I feel like you touched on that, and I know that that's a very important part. So going beyond the needs, but also getting into that values, getting into those like kind of like core tenets of a co-op. How is that like garnered, or is that something that's baked into all of these like nonprofits that help?
That is such a good question. Thank you. So this is a problem, especially in like a TOPA. I'm sorry, a tenant opportunity to purchase circumstance, where suddenly you might know some of your people in your building, you don't know all of them, and then you have 60 days, and it's like, hey, let's buy the building, and then what do? Then all the conflict comes out, or all the different opinions and needs. Like, you might not feel like you have the right to say, you know what, I really want to own this place and build value for my family. Somebody else might say, I really want to just have this be accessible to whoever lives in the community at the lowest price possible. And that all comes out after, because what your first thing you agreed on was, hey, we should buy the building. So I think that is key to these groups in DC, for instance, that are doing that work on the short term, that they're checking for those things. And everybody doesn't necessarily have to agree on that, because buying the building might be that important that you're still in solidarity with whatever model got picked by the group. This is also part of the values. So not every group is going to be the right group of people to form a co-op. But if you have democracy, if you have the values, democracy, equity, equality, and solidarity, then you can have your fights in a way that isn't destructive, come up with something you're going to agree on, even if it isn't exactly what I want. Yeah, I want to buy this building. I love this neighborhood. My kids are in the school here. I do not want to move. And the value of not moving might just mean, you know what, I'm going to be in solidarity with the majority of the people in this building, because we all agree we don't want to move again. But that's totally true. And I think that ongoing consulting, you know, I'm talking as a former consultant, now I'm the manager, but it is so important to have resources of a network. Because if you're an island, it's so hard to know. It's not hard to know. It's just useful to have perspective of other people that have been through that before. So in DC, for instance, there's an association of housing co-ops. So you don't necessarily need a consultant. You just join that, and then they can bring people in as needed to be able to help with that work. Or if there was a community group that started in the first place, or a faith-based group that started the housing in the first place, then you have this kind of built-in outside perspective. And not just that, but that built-in resources to be able to bring in extra people if the outside perspective doesn't have the skills and knowledge that you need for whatever challenge you might be facing at the time. Oh, there we got one more.
So what I really like about all this is that the profiteer is gone, right? I think that's kind of the whole point of this, is you're removing the landlord who is profiting and extracting wealth from all the tenants. Going back to the question about the land trust. So if there's a land trust and a cooperative, so these are basically two organizations that have two separate boards.
Mm-hmm.
And Okay, so there's some interaction there. Okay. The other thing that's coming to mind is, you know, when you're just renting out in the world, you sign a lease, you pay the landlord something, and it's very easy. You know, just kind of they take your money and don't fix anything, and then you like at the end of the lease, if you want to leave, leave. If not, you pay them more money. How do you make living in a cooperative as easy? Because it seems like this could get very difficult for somebody who is just trying to live and has, you know, a million other things that they have to deal with.
Well, it is more difficult.
Oh, okay.
I mean, and it's, you know, denying it would be a lie, right? You're the owner too, right? So you also have to decide, you know what, that stack is about to go. Should we fix it now, or should we just let it go until it breaks? And then we have all the water damage from the break also. Or, you know, this furnace already isn't working very well. 2 of the units are too hot and 2 of them are too cold. We've got people opening their window on the 5th floor to be able to manage temperature. So anyway, and they're a minority in the group who's arguing for, you know what, we really need to invest on a better HVAC system. But, you know, 80% of the people are fine. So that those kinds of conflicts are going to come up. It is not going to be as easy. This is why your people are important.
Is support our university co-op itself, right? So anybody who lives in it, but it's really critical and then talked about it. One of the principles of cooperatives is education. So continually. What's happening, making sure that you have really well functioning.
This sounds like it requires a real long term. Like, what is like a minimum length commitment somebody needs to invest in this in order for it? I'm talking about a co-op. But I mean, this sounds like you're entering into a long-term relationship. So in your experience.
I can restate that. So what's a minimum length of time that you would need to commit? It seems like you're going into a long-term commitment. So I'll just say with the students, the average term is a year, right? And there's people who just come in for summer. It's like, or visiting students that just come in for 6 weeks, or scholars or what have you. So you can design it where you can have high turnover, but that just means your education has to be better, right? Because in that window, you need to recruit people who are going to stay long enough to learn what it means to be on the board, to do the capital planning, which is why it's important for student housing co-ops to actually have staff who both they set expectations for, but who provides that long-term perspective. And now I think if you're in a limited equity co-op or a market rate co-op, those are longer term. Obviously, if you mean to build wealth, you're going to stick around. But you could leave. You might just decide that's not for me. It's 6 months in. It's like, oh yeah, I've got the same needs as all these people. I can work with them. And no, you can't. And so, in general, I think it should be hard to get into a co-op. And I don't mean you should be preventing people from getting in, but you need to do some work to figure out you should be part of that co-op, right? You need to get some of that education first. This is not just come in for 1 year lease and leave, although you can do that. So it should also be easy to leave, right? So when it's like, you know what, this isn't for me. You need to be able to let those people go. You shouldn't be trying to convince somebody who thinks it isn't what they need, because that will create conflicts that you might not be able to resolve. Because people who want to leave and are being held in, they find things to fight over, right? So I don't think there is a set of time. There's always going to be a continuum of involvement. And that's one of the things that was asked, you know, how do you incentivize members to be involved? And I can tell you with the student housing co-ops, we actually offer discounts to people who are willing to be on the executive committee of the board. We also offer discounts to people who attend training and fill officer roles at the houses. So if you go to the training about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and you go on to be a president of the house, you're actually getting a discount. If you're elected to be president of the house and you haven't gone to any trainings, you get to be president of the house, but you don't get a discount to do it because you didn't come and learn what the values of the cooperative were. So those are ways of doing it in a high turnover situation. I think with a lot of limited equity and market rate co-ops, what happens is a couple of people become the officers of the board, start attending conferences, and they do that for the entire tenure that they're there, and everybody else is like, okay, well, they take care of that extra work for me. And then that extra work includes, you know, junkets. If you look, I don't mean to say something bad about the Association of Co-ops, but the National Association of Housing Co-ops, if you look at the locations of their annual conferences, it's like Puerto Rico, Miami, Hawaii, and these are incentives, right, to get people to be leaders. Is come to the conference. It's going to be in a really cool place where you get to play for 4 days. I don't mean that as a bad thing, but there needs to be a way of incentivizing, and that's what the National Association. And being part of the association means you have access to resources when you need it, like what you were asking about that education, or what about, how do you get access to that information that you need to be able to make a decision that maybe you weren't ready for, or that you have a conflict that you aren't able to navigate successfully in the group. Being part of an association is a way of having access to those resources or consultants that would be able to help navigate.
We do have a couple of questions on Zoom. So there was a follow-up to Karen's previous question on limited equity co-ops. So for Karen's question, she also asked, are there any places where they could find stats or write-ups about limited equity co-ops outside of the state of New York? So a place to find those resources, and particularly in cities where POCs are the majority of tenants.
So recently there's been some research done, particularly on these mutual housing associations, by a group in New York City. The acronym is UHAB. It's the Urban Homesteaders Association Board, I think it's that acronym, but UHAB.coop got grant money to do research. Now that was not just on, it was on mutual housing, so zero equity co-ops, where those are around the country, how long they've been there. But really, this is a peril of housing co-ops, because everyone is about spending as little money as possible. So sharing, this is another value of being part of an association, because at least you can do surveys in an association. But that still doesn't happen very much. So I would recommend the National Association of Housing Cooperatives. You have, who I mentioned in New York City, and the research they did was nationwide, because I participated in that, working with my co-op in Michigan and other housing co-ops that I've worked with. And then, but particularly with these limited equity co-ops, they often become an island. So even accessing the group, who do you talk to get a survey filled out? That it's enough. Getting people to fulfill the obligation of being on the board and convening meetings 4 times a year is all that's going to happen there. Surveying the members and getting data can be a challenge. And I think that there is a lack of that kind of data, unfortunately.
I do have some follow-up questions on Zoom. We got another question from Margaret. Thank you for joining us, Margaret. Margaret says, the senior housing co-ops in the Twin Cities are very much real estate developer driven. The real estate company will build the facility and then recruit members to live there when the construction is nearly complete. What do you think about that kind of strategy?
I think where there's sufficient demand, you can get away with that. That one of my favorite people that I've met on this journey is a fellow from Ontario. His name is Michel LeBay, and he used to be a co-op developer for the state of Ontario, for the province of Ontario, before the province disbanded that. And he was kind of the most aggressive person going on developing housing co-ops. And that's what he did. And his model was to find the people with the most construction experience who could give them the most accurate cost of construction, and also, timeline, get all the permits from the city. These are the people, the biggest property builders, and then start recruiting people. It's like, okay, here's our land. I'm going to put an option on this land, and I'm going to go find enough people to be a steering committee who will then go on and do the marketing so that during construction, we will be full enough that this will be a co-op when it's done. And in Toronto, there were enough of those people, or in the Twin Cities, there's enough of those people. And frankly, and I think I want to say something about rural areas, because I don't think I've said enough about that right now, but often in a rural area, you will have people that have lived there their whole lives, that are in a big house that they own free and clear, or they own 80% of. So there is a lot of untapped equity who love the community and want to stay, but there's no place for them to go to that isn't their big house that they don't want to have to maintain now, or particularly if it's on a farm, or they've got a half an acre they have to maintain and they don't want to do it. So there was a group I was working with in Hart, Michigan, which is a really cool little town. It's the county seat of Oceana County, Michigan. 10,000 people. They own their utilities. The city owns the utilities. And why would you want to move out of that city, except that you don't want to manage this 4-bedroom house and raise your family in when it's just you and your husband. And so the developer, the county developer, did a LIHTC project, low-income housing tax credit project. And many people approached them about, hey, I want to move into those because I want to stay in town. But they didn't income qualify. They had too many assets. They owned this house free and clear in town. So when we presented this presentation to MISTA, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, MISTA said, well, we won't be able to help finance the co-op, but we can help finance first-time home buyers to buy those houses from the seniors, who can then take that equity and invest it in the co-op and be able to build townhouses in town that they can move into. And this is a town of 10,000 that when I met with the steering committee, there were 25 people turned up. 10,000 people and 25 of them were there willing to work on creating this co-op to make it happen. Now, sadly, that was derailed by the city manager, who thought this was some dangerous idea that, I don't know what, but irrationally decided that we shouldn't use land for this in the city. Hopefully they retire soon. But the point is, when you can find the demand and you have the right people, it can be done. And it can be done even in small populations. I do think it's extra important to have organizations where you have affinity groups already started. And that could be faith groups, it could be civic organizations, it could be nonprofit activist groups.
So Brian, really appreciate it. It's been extremely informative. So I do want to, you talked about low-income housing tax credit cooperatives, in particular, how investment's much more common now than going into cooperative. Are there any states or cities or particular organizations that are bucking that trend, that are effectively using the low-income tax credit program to start cooperatives?
So renting partnerships, who I recruited to be on the panel, they got started in the low-income housing tax credit group and came up with this renter equity method so tenants could actually build wealth through that. And that was without it being a co-op. But they transitioned it to being like a land trust with some members on the board. So not a true co-op, but with tenant representation on the board. And you'll hear more about that model. But there are very few. I mean, personally, I think financing with LIHTC can be a challenge. I do believe we have somebody here who has been able to do that. So I would like to defer.
We did do a project in South Bend with LIHTC, and it's a co-op. Ms. Woolley is the board president. She's here. And I think it worked out pretty well. We got a special, it was hard to get the credits awarded, but we got a special award in the innovation round. And Jacob Syke will be here later today. And I would say it's working out pretty well. The resident participation, we built it and then got the residents, but is close to a community center. And so we got a lot of people that knew about it from the community center. And then we looked for people with, that volunteered in the community. So if somebody volunteered, they got a higher priority to get in. And there's a waiting list. There's a huge demand and the rents are very affordable. So we have like 90 people on the waiting list. And I think the current challenge is how do people participate? And then how do you make group decisions? And people weren't used to that. Because you get your average 24 families, you know, they don't always know how to be on a board and make decisions. So it's very challenging for the board president. But my question is, how could cooperatives, I mean, they're a good thing for some people, but they seem very sidelined now. So how could we get more cooperatives? It isn't like a hot thing to do and funders aren't waiting. So what do you think we could do to promote cooperatives more?
Do you mind just saying the name of your co-op?
My name is Ann Mannix and it's South Bend Mutual Homes Cooperative. And Ms. Willie Deering is the board president.
Thanks so much for coming and sharing.
Yeah, I will answer questions later, but I'm real interested in the things you're saying. It's a good presentation.
So I think that and this gets to scaling, which is another thing that was brought up. You know, how do we scale housing cooperatives? So personally, I like that tenant opportunity to purchase agreement. It doesn't guarantee the tenants are able to buy the building, but they're at least notified when the building is going up for sale, and they have a window to put an offer together. That has been huge, and DC is one of the most rapidly appreciating and gentrifying areas in the country. And there have been hundreds and hundreds of cooperatives that have been developed in that case. In terms of doing it in rural areas or in cities that are less politically inclined to protect tenants and more inclined to protect investors, that, you know, there is no easy answer there to be able to do that. But I think that when you have groups of people that want to do it, you can find those properties. And don't be intimidated by building a relationship with the landlord and leasing a property. That can really work. I mean, the landlord's work that they have to put in, that they don't have to do any make ready, they don't have to do any recruiting and turnover management. The co-op will handle that, which is a huge lift off. That I remember in Austin, we looked at potentially buying a property, and the tenants who were in there were interested in being a co-op. And when I say we, it was the student housing co-op there. But the person selling wanted too much money, but the person who bought it was like a family trust out of New York City. And so this fellow flew in from Brooklyn, he was trying to set it all up, and I asked him to meet them. And I said, you know, the tenants here want this to be a co-op. And I think it could be really beneficial to you. They ended up leasing it to the co-op. It's now 12 years down the line. Co-op still has this blanket lease, and the landlord is delighted because they don't even want to be in Austin. And they mostly don't have to be because the co-op is in place. So actually talking to the owners, if you can have access to them, you know, leasing can work. And ultimately that group is sucking away reserves. So they're in a position to be able to buy another property down the line. Hopefully, that's how all the student housing co-ops got started, was leasing, building up reserves. There's a crash in real estate value. They're there with cash. Go ahead.
Kind of building on, oh, thanks. Kind of building on a lot of the questions that have happened prior to this. I think looking at these amazing examples of different cooperatives, and then looking at examples that you mentioned from DC or New York or the People's Republic of Ann Arbor, you know, where these things are maybe more complex. Indianapolis might be like the most regressive reactionary city as far as politics go. I don't think that many people, even people on the most receiving end of the most nasty gentrification and like slumlord abuse, would even consider like this as an option. A lot of people don't even know that that's something that could happen. And a lot of the kids that work with me on the farm who, you know, are moving with their families every 8 months because of landlord issues, when I talk to them about what they want to do, they want to be landlords themselves. You know, they, what's the Paulo Freire quote with if education isn't liberating, the goal of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. So how can we get people to even like understand that this is an option? Because our city council and our mayor, there's a housing crisis in Indianapolis, and none of these ideas are being discussed. How do you suggest getting the word out and educating people? Because 100 years of Red Scare propaganda, anything cooperative or collective is kind of out of our vocabulary. And in Indianapolis, for instance, I don't know how familiar you are with it here. There's the community land trust groups, and there's the 30 of us that are interested in it here and our Zoom people, but it's not something that, especially the people again on the receiving end of the housing crisis, really discussing. What are your suggestions?
Well, the first thing is we have to participate in the market, right? And the fact that this many people turned up is good. And the fact that Kefroots is doing the work that it's doing is good. And the more faith-based groups that are doing the work is good. The fact that you could just go over to South Bend and see an example of a successful implementation. All of these things, it is about building a network, right? So it's a whole nother presentation about my theory of change if you want me to go into it. But I like the 2 loops theory. If you look on YouTube for 2 loops theory of change, I like that. So you have kind of the dying system that's going down, but people don't jump off of it until something else is coming up. It's like, oh, wow, that's better. And the reason why you're not, and of course, the current system or the declining system doesn't want to give up any power and control, right? So they're deliberately undermining all the networking that's happening in the up and coming system. But eventually, the resilience and networking can lead to actually an ascent, and eventually, you know, that these 2 loops, they never touch, but it becomes obvious to everyone that we have to jump to this other thing. And that's, I mean, it might not even be in my lifetime, and I've now been doing this work for 25 years of trying to build the network that's going to mean that we change to a system that actually cares about people and doesn't want to leave anyone behind. That is a journey. That may not be a value that everyone shares, but cooperative ownership is a way of doing that. And frankly, for me, I've learned a lot from Indigenous people. Detroit has the most Indigenous people of any city in the United States. They were living, you know, they didn't differentiate between the world and themselves. You know, there wasn't like that. So they were always integrated in the way that we treated everything that's alive. And that's just part of the personal journey, and also just living in Highland Park where I live, which is one of the wealthiest cities in Detroit, and now has some of the highest, in Michigan, it's in the middle of Detroit, and now has some of the highest poverty levels in the state. The people who are there that are leaving, they have overcome a lot, and its community is what means that persistence can happen, and there's nothing to do but carry on. I mean, you have to carry on, and no matter how regressive it is, go try to find that city council person that's going to be able to represent you. Then don't give up. You can always just work within yourselves, but you should always be advocating to staff. Maybe it's a staff person that's going to get you, that's going to be able to represent your case to the elected officials. That's going to mean that, oh, this is actually something that will benefit the investors who are buying, who are paying for me to run a campaign to get elected.
Brian, just a heads up for those who are in Indiana, I'm available to help to come do education about cooperatives. Like if you've got a group that you want to introduce the cooperative concept to, I'll put some cards out on the front desk, so on that table, so feel free to reach out to me. And just another thought, our colleagues up in the Northwest in Washington State, just this legislative session are passing a law. They've been behind this and pushing it forward about the right of first refusal kind of thing, especially for mobile home parks. New Hampshire started it, I believe. So when a park comes up for sale, and Brian mentioned this a little bit, that the tenants, the people who live there, have a window to put in an offer to buy before it goes out to the general public. And I know they've spent a number of years getting that to happen. And Brian's right, we have to educate our legislators about the co-op. And maybe the co-op is not the right word to use. Maybe it's shared ownership or community ownership. Sometimes that word cooperative kind of turns people off, and collective, especially, people think that's some kind of a socialist idea and could be further from the truth. It's simply people coming together to solve a shared problem. That's all a co-op is. So, happy to help. I think sometimes it takes a long time. Absolutely.
That's why I said maybe not in my lifetime. That doesn't mean I shouldn't keep working on building a resilient network that's going to mean that the transition happens, because it will happen. I mean, the question is how deep, how much suffering until there can be something that's coming up that's obviously what we need to switch to. I do have some more slides that I want to get through before we get to 12 o'clock. But I'm glad we were able to. I wanted to talk about this slide because it is a ton, and I don't want to just move past it. But if we can go on to the next one, and I think there still will be time for questions. But I want to look at. I think we've talked about most of these. It's all the benefits of home ownership, except you don't have the title. You have sustainable owner occupancy. You do not have to move. Once you're a member, you are in. And you've got this fine-tunable balance between wealth creation and affordability at the lowest possible operating cost. This is true no matter what the wealth, no matter whether you're trying to build wealth or not, you're still trying to operate as efficiently as possible. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So the home ownership benefits could be through wealth creation, greater satisfaction, improved child outcomes. I mentioned not moving, but not moving is so valuable. If you can go to school in the same school all the way through with a cohort of people, it is huge. And then skill and confidence building. So the members become owners. You are learning what it means to own it. And not only that, you're learning what it means to run democratic processes, to navigate conflict, to come back together after conflict in solidarity, continuing to meet your needs, which is, I do not want to underestimate that. I mean, this is actually the mayor of Ann Arbor right now is a former president of the Intercooperative Council where I work. So learning these values, learning how to govern, I'm getting weepy, but learning how to govern matters, right? And you need people to learn how to govern who govern. So it isn't just learning how to do it, it's doing it. And then being able to represent the value of doing it so that you get elected. We'll go on to the next one. So there's a benefit to the community too. So this is what you're bringing to your elected officials, right? You want stability. You want people living in the neighborhood who see it as their neighborhood, you know, who are going to say something when graffiti goes up on the fence across the street that's advocating violence, or that competing tags, whatever, you know, that are going to clean up and care. Talk to the people, get the young people involved, right? And then the side effect of that is reduced crime. The more there's stability, that matters a ton. When it looks like nobody's looking, that's when anything can happen. And it also improves property values. And it's a base for community development. So often a co-op happens because of community development. Then once it's there, it becomes an additional center for being able to do more. Like what I'm suggesting about the group in South Bend, potentially being a source to learn more so that more communities can do a similar thing. Well, okay, so in a co-op, you can't just sublease, right? You have to live there. If you're moving out, you have to sell so that the owners are the people that live there. So this is a big difference between a condo. With a condo, or like in college towns, this is often the case where a wealthy parent will buy a condo for their kid to live in during school, and then afterwards they'll rent to students down the line, and it becomes a wealth building for them. So with a student housing co-op, we rotate those students. So the owners are always the people that live there. This is going to be true in a limited equity or a market-based co-op as well. And then the cooperative has the right to approve who gets to move in. Now, we're still subject to fair housing laws, so you can't just say, you can't, protected classes are still protected, right? But you could say, you don't have the values that you need. And people should be able to self-identify. This is why I'm saying it should be hard to get in. Not that you're preventing anybody, but they need to do the work to understand what it means to be a member of the co-op. And it should be easy to leave. So 6 months in, it's like, man, I can't work with these people. They should be able to get out. And so the co-op will then go try to find again, because you're never going to be perfect on picking. And you want to err on the side of letting people in, because even if they don't obviously fit, they might learn, right? So cut them some slack, but then if they need to go, you need to be able to let them go. And then also cooperatives approve any loans. So in a market rate co-op, I might, if it costs me 50 grand to get in, I don't have 50 grand in cash. So I might borrow money to pay my share to get in. But the property does not have a lien on it, right? Because I only have a share of this corporation. So the co-op is who the lien is against. Does that make sense? This is lending language. So if I'm borrowing money to buy my way into a co-op, I can go to a bank and say, hey, I'm going to live in this unit. I'm going to have a share in this corporation that owns the property, but I cannot encumber the land. And what I mean by that is normally, if I'm a single family homeowner, when I buy that land, the bank actually owns it because they've got a lien that says, if you can't pay, we're taking it. So that doesn't happen with a co-op. It's a lien against the corporation. It's okay if that isn't totally clear, and I'm happy to elaborate further. But what that means is that the cooperative has to approve any loan that a member is taking. And that way, the co-op will not let a member be suckered into some predatory loan that's going to mean the co-op is on the hook for that predatory loan. So even though you might not be experienced with how banks might take advantage of you, the co-op is like a backstop for that, because ultimately the co-op will have to pay your loan if you're unable to pay it. So collectively, the group would have to pay. So we'll go on to the next one. Or actually, I'll pause on that if there are, if you want further elaboration on that. Okay. So there's multiple ways of saving money, economies of scale in the development itself. So if you're building 20 homes instead of one home, it's going to cost less to do that. And you have all the same decision-making that's related to the type of building. So obviously a low-rise apartment building is going to be the least expensive thing to build, but maybe everybody wants a single-family home with quarter-acre yard. Well, you can do that. You get economy of scale of doing that, but it's going to cost you more per unit to be able to do it. All those realities are there. But also on operating costs. So with the student housing co-op that I manage, the members in each location pool their resources to buy food and supplies. And they're members of a purchasing co-op. That means they get the best prices from Gordon Foods, from local produce providers, which means that they get better stuff or more stuff. If they want to have more instead of better, but they're able to develop economies of scale to be able to collectively buy their food. This is all tied to occupancy cost reductions. When you're insuring, when there's one insurance policy for property and liability for all of the properties together, that's going to cost less than everybody insuring their units separately. Just as an example. Then this is a big one. If it's a market rate or limited equity co-op, and you are selling your share when you exit, that is not a real estate transaction, because the corporation still owns it. You're just selling your ownership stake in the corporation. So there's no title insurance, there's no tax. The property never, the state doesn't care. It's like it didn't sell. We're handling all that business ourselves. And this is the same kind of thing that a landlord who's leasing to a co-op would benefit, because they didn't have to handle all the costs of turnover and recruiting people, because the co-op did all that. But in this case, because I mean, if you bought or sold a house, you could pay $5,000, $10,000 for title research to prove that the seller has a right to sell it to you. When if it's a co-op, there's no real estate transaction. You're just sharing who has the right to occupy a particular unit. And then also you don't subdivide. The co-op is one unit. Now, if it's a scattered site where you have houses in different places in the neighborhood, then obviously that is already subdivided. But if you're building an apartment building, you don't have to make condos out of it where each person owns their little box. It's just one unit that everybody has a space in that gets defined in the occupancy agreement, instead of having to subdivide for the county to keep track of who owns each piece. And then we've also got blanket financing. So the co-op can borrow money. So let's say your credit is terrible. You can still be part of a co-op because the co-op is going to borrow the money, and they don't look at everyone's credit history when the co-op is borrowing the money. Can you move in? Can you pay your carrying charges? That's all that matters, whether you declared bankruptcy last year or not. We can go on to the next one. So I want to just talk a little bit about financing. I know we have a financing person who's going to be coming in later, but a blanket loan, this is what I was talking about before. There are loan guarantees that are available only for co-ops. So this is a regular single family home. You need a 20% down payment, and you're borrowing the other 80% of your purchase. So this is the typical single family model. So with a co-op, you can borrow 98% of your cost. The co-op can borrow 98% of the cost, and the federal government will guarantee it through this HUD 213 or 221D4 financing. Now, there aren't a lot of banks that do that. You're probably going to have to work with a bank out of Minneapolis, because that's where the HUD office that handles all these are. But hey, if you can borrow 98% of the cost, that really lowers the barrier of entry if your goal is to do group equity or even a limited equity co-op. So we can go on to the next one. So this is what a limited equity co-op model would look like after several years. So this is the equity each person gets, that they've earned by being there for 10 years. Or like this person's only been there moved in 3 years ago or whatever, so they've got less. Then this is the equity that is retained by the co-op. So because you only get a partial return, say like the 1% guaranteed return that I mentioned as an example, the rest of that asset appreciation is here with the co-op. So potentially the co-op can borrow more money. This is the remaining debt here that's been paid down. So it started out maybe even 98% obligated, and now members are building wealth, the co-op is building wealth, and this is how much remaining principal there is on the loan. Okay, so this is a market rate co-op after several years. So in a market rate co-op, you very rarely would have that 98% blanket loan, because it's about members making return on their investment. So members, if you're going to do a market rate co-op, presumably members have assets to bring to the table. The example I used would be a senior who owned a house free and clear that now is going to sell that house and put some of that money into the co-op at the start. So even in the beginning, they might have already put in this much money into that cost. So the co-op could borrow less to start with. But typically there would still be like a 30% blanket loan. You wouldn't, why not take advantage of the fact that you can get a long-term low interest loan guaranteed by HUD for as much leverage as you can do it? So even in a market rate, you still would have central charges that would have to be covered. But then people can bring in different amounts of equity. Maybe they had to borrow the money to put their equity in. But this is how it would look. So different people, depending on how much they paid down, have different amounts of equity. And then the co-op would still retain some equity from even in a market rate. So I think there's one more. Okay, and so this is the group housing or the LIHTC or the low-income housing tax credit example. So in this case, and this is like the student housing co-ops, we've been around since 1944 was the first house. We incorporated in 44 to buy. We started in 1932 with renting. So we have a lot of houses we own free and clear. But in this case, you have the blanket loan, and then these are all the members, but none of them have equity. It's all restricted. It's held by the corporation. And any surplus that's generated that's not put into reserves just rolls into keeping the price down the next year. So in this case, there might have been 80% borrowing in the get-go, but then down the line that gets paid off and can be leveraged to expand or for capital improvements, whatever you might have to do with the group equity. Now, in the case of a tax credit, this might be the tax credit, the assets held by the participants who are getting the tax credits. Then they will sell that, and then your blanket loan will come up to whatever it costs you to buy them out. That would then eventually be able to turn into either a limited equity or whatever equity model you decide you want to. I think that's it. See, is there one more? Okay, that's it. So we are almost at 12, but do you have any questions? Or I hope I will make this presentation available, just like Terry Lewis made it available to me, so that you can take it away and be able to re-show it. And you're welcome also to contact me. I should have put my contact information on there.
I'll get it to him, Brian.
Okay, good. Thank you. So we have a couple minutes before lunch, and I'm happy to answer questions at lunch.
I have a question. I don't know how relevant this is, but when you think about the people who are having the hardest time accessing housing, those would be like the homeless, people with severe mental health issues, and they are often losing their housing because of not having ownership of it. Have there been examples of kinds of organizing efforts to create housing cooperatives that kind of are owned by those like right most vulnerable people who use drugs, people who are chronically homeless, perpetuating chronically homeless.
So, yes, and it can be extremely challenging to be able to handle it. I think having everyone coming in from that kind of exposed population or that kind of challenged population, it's very difficult to be able to find and develop the leaders. Now, in the student housing co-ops, that is a regular thing that people want to do. It's like, oh, we should let this person move in and not pay. And they'll just do it. Oh, you can live in our basement. And the generally, it doesn't work out. It's a violation of the agreement for starters. Everybody has to be a member, join, and pay. No subletting or any of that. But we have had people coming out of emancipated foster youth who are attending college, who often rise to leadership quickly, and their trauma comes into play in the democratic conflict that happens of either not getting something their way or some terribly rude attack as a way of undermining their argument by attacking them as a person. And it's like, I can't be here anymore. But that doesn't mean that wasn't worth it for them, even though they had to leave because of an offense that was something, bad ideas that people carry around with them that they haven't put aside yet. So I don't know, that's a very complicated question. But I don't think it's a good idea, and this is just me talking now, to bunch up people from that kind of a challenged background. Integrating some of people from a challenged background is more suitable, in my opinion.
I was just guessing.
You can go and then Alan.
Kind of as a direct response, our housing model in Evansville incorporates a lot of people with background challenges, but in part because it's just how provide a first use about so often it's their own property that we help secure. It's very problematic and they've lost several of those properties, but because it's a neighborhood, those relationships are still sustained, and we're able to stabilize their property and or those relationships for a longer period of time. So it's not, I don't feel like it's a loss. It's just a really precarious model. But we're not incorporating those people. They're just already the people who are.
Yes. Can you say the name of your organization?
We don't really have a name because it's just like neighbors. I'm here for a group called Haitians in Evansville for redress of emancipation. Some of our neighbors are Haitian refugees. We are trying to build a legal cooperative model for those specific leaders.
Thank you. Hey, Alan.
Yeah, I was just gonna add in response to that, there's a website called villagemodel.org. It's an organization in Eugene, Oregon that has created Opportunity Village Eugene and some more permanent transitional kind of housing that kind of this original project feeds into. So the villagemodel.org, and the organization is called Square One Villages, and they've tried to apply some of the limited equity co-op stuff to working with various populations. So I think there's a lot of good YouTube videos on it.
A direct question. I mean, I can see how it worked. Do you have any knowledge of experiences around the country where a land bank has played a direct role in creating conditions so that a housing cooperative has tools that it needs to be able to thrive?
I think Bloomington, I'm sorry, not Bloomington, Burlington, Vermont. One of the first land trusts got started in Burlington, Vermont, and they have done a really good job of expanding. And I think they now, for all their multi-family units, they now lease to cooperatives. They were doing rentals, but I think they've moved towards cooperative, cooperatizing. those. And I think there's a land bank that has helped them be able to do the acquisitions of properties. I know in Detroit and Highland Park that has not happened. I have presented a couple times at different in the city about to people who weren't interested in doing land trusts or cooperatives. And you know, what I'm encouraging is advocacy. We have a good network there, but there needs to be a will to do that. And I think there's some concerns which are not valid, in my opinion, about, oh, well, we can't give all these land bank properties to nonprofits that could then be tax exempt. But that generally a cooperative is not tax exempt. So it is putting it back on the tax rolls. But that argument has to be made. And I will say, just to go back, that at ICC, we're actually partnering with a group that does transitional housing for people coming out of incarceration in the summer. So you never half full even in the summer. So we actually give some of the houses to another organization. They pay us a fee, so we get some income and can reduce prices for our members. And then they put both a combination of service providers and transitional folks looking for permanent housing into the houses. That has worked pretty well with both youth and returning citizens. But it's only for summer, so if they don't have a place in that window.
Why is it?
Because we're occupying the houses during the academic year completely.
We have one person who was couple who was formerly homeless in the co-op, and they're doing fine, but they have gone through a long recovery. And then there's another person, she has a criminal record, and we had like a group of like 50 people, and then she's like, well, I have a friend with a criminal record. Do you take people? And she's kind of a scary looking person, so everyone's like, oh. And then we said it depends on the circumstances, but she's worked out okay too. But there are a lot of co-ops from the 60s. There's about 5 in South Bend that your slides helped me remember. And they're like 5 or 6 co-ops that are doing fine, and they just kind of blend into the woodwork. But one of them is like $200 a month to live in because they paid off all their debt, and they keep it up really well. So, and in Indianapolis, there's co-ops. I don't know if anyone's here from Kirkpatrick, but they manage, I don't know how many co-ops. Yeah, a whole bunch. So they're around, you just don't see them. They're inconspicuous, but they're a good deal too.
Go ahead and break now. Lunch is through that door over there. And there are labels, there's sandwiches and salads. If you have a dietary issue, please find the one that relates to you. And if you don't have a dietary issue, please don't take the ones that are labeled gluten-free or whatever. And we'll start up again about 12:45, but feel free to talk amongst yourselves. Brian's going to be here the rest of the day, so if you've got additional questions for him, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer those.